Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Fundamentals of Programming. Today we're going to be talking about while loops. Now, while loops are a specific subset of loops, and there will be other videos on the other types of loops. But today is specifically on while loops, which are some of the most fundamental types of loops that you will use in any kind of programming language. So let's go ahead and talk about, in general, what loops are. So, in general, loops are code blocks that repeat within a program. So if you think about when we had an if, else, and elif statements, we would run a code block once if that condition was true. Now with loops, we can run the same code block multiple times based on that condition, which allows us to, repeat the amount of copy pasting we might have had, which some of you might have been doing. You might have been copy pasting your conditions multiple times to make your code work. Sometimes you can use a loop instead, and that code block can be repeated much more simply. There are three types of loops. There's a while loop, which checks conditions, and if that condition is true, we're going to run a code block. If it is false, it'll break out of the loop. There's something called a for loop, which executes a specific number of iterations, and all that means is it's going to run the code block a specific number of times and then stop. Then there's something called a for in loop, which performs operations on items in an array. And remember, arrays are things like lists, tuples, and dictionaries. And we'll look at some examples later on in this series and see what the use of a for in loop is. And they're very useful. So let's talk about specifically while loops, though. So while loops are going to repeat a code block as long as the condition is true. So if we had a condition, this code block over here is only going to be run if the condition stated here is true. So let's say we started off with x equals 1 and the condition was x is less than 10. Now this condition is always going to be true, so this code block is going to be running forever. Now that's something called an infinite loop, and we'll look at an example of that, and those can be useful. So this would be running forever, but let's say this condition at some point became false. Maybe we were changing the value of x to increase over time, and eventually x was, greater than or equal to 10, which would then make this condition false. We would break out of this while loop, and our code would move on to the next piece, which is kind of how the if-else statement works, except for we don't repeat this code block, but we are still checking a condition here. So that's a similarity between while loops and if-else loops. So just some background information on while loops and some terminology here. Each time the code block will run is known as an iteration. So each time we go over to this code block after we check this condition is known as an iteration. So we could be checking, there could be infinite iterations or there could be 2 iterations. But each time we run this code block will be known as an iteration. And I'll use that term pretty frequently, so get used to that term. The number of iterations can be controlled by the use of an increment variable, and this will allow us to, usually these increment variables are related to the condition that we're checking here, so that we could set the number of iterations here, and we're not stuck in this loop forever if we, want it to end. So let's kind of compare if, else, and elif statements here, so with a while loop. So if we started off with both of these, if an if statement and a while statement or a while loop, x equals 1. Now, we'll say if x is less than 10 and while x is less than 10, which is the only difference between these two pieces of code. The code block for the if statement will say print string x is a single digit, so we're converting x to a string and saying it's a single digit. Then we're adding x, 1 to x. And then with the if statement, that's simply going to end at the same place if x was less than 10. With the while statement, though, we're going to start off with x equals 1, check if x is less than 10. If that's true, we're going to print string x is a single digit, add x equals x plus 1, go back, check the condition. If that's still true, we're going to do the same code block again, and we're going to continue in this loop until this condition is false. So the big difference here with an if statement is with the if statement, it only runs the code block once. With a while loop, it's going to run this condition or this code block until that condition is false. So it's going to repeat whatever is inside the code block until that condition is false, which is very different. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example. What we have here is just a simple if statement. Now, x starts off as 1, we initiate it as 1, so this is the initial value of x, and then we check if x is less than 10, we print the value of x with a string, and then add 1 to x. So x would increase in value. Now with this if statement, it's going to check the condition, print this, x is a single digit, add 1 to x, and then go and end. So if I hit run, that's all it does. It prints 1 as a single digit. What is it? Which really isn't that exciting. So, but the power of a while loop is that if I replace this if statement with a while, notice this is the same condition that I was checking before, I'm actually going to get this code block to run until this condition is false. So now, as long as this condition right here is true, this code block will be executed, which is different than an if statement, which will run if it is true, but not as long as it is true, or while it is true, which is why it's called a while loop. So it's going to run while that condition is true. So if I hit run now, I go ahead and get each of these single-digit numbers up until 10, where the condition is false, and then the code will end. So that's the power of a while loop. So let's go ahead and go take a look back at our flowchart here. And if we look at it, notice this flowchart shows exactly that. X equals 1. If x is less than 10 is true, we go ahead and print that value, and then x equals x plus 1, and we end. But with the while statement, x equals 1, while x is less than 10 is true, we print that value, add 1 to it, and then go back and check the condition. So we're repeating this code block until this condition is false, which is really powerful. Now, what do you guys think would happen if I took out this x equals x plus 1? So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So if I take this out, now x is always going to be 1, which means this condition here will always be true. Now that's going to create what's called an infinite loop. So if I hit run, it's going to freak out a little bit, or it's just going to, yep, oh, I froze my computer here. So this is called an infinite loop, and infinite loops can cause problems. Notice I'm trying to print this 1,000 times, and it has frozen it. So that's why we try to avoid infinite loops, at least with printing things. You can run infinite loops when necessary, but you don't want to print things when you do that. So let's look at an example where an infinite loop can be used more appropriately, which is usually where you're not actually printing a value each time. Like, look, this says my page is unresponsive, and I'm going to go ahead and kill it. And I'll come back in just a second here after I get my web browser back up and running, because I just killed it with an infinite loop. Not surprising there. So this is an infinite loop example that's actually kind of useful. So this infinite loop example is going to ask for the thrust of an engine, and if that thrust is greater than 100, that's greater than the threshold of the engine, so we would shut down the engine. And I'll explain how that works here in a second. But the first thing I want to mention is that this line of code here in line 1 is I'm importing the time module, and modules have functions or methods that do something that aren't in the default Python package. So notice I have this time.sleep method down here. That's just going to wait 10 seconds until it moves on to the next line of code, which in this case would be back up to the top of the loop. Now, a couple things to notice in this code. The first thing is that it says while true. Now, if you recall the definition of a while loop, that means that this while loop is always true. The condition here is literally true, which means, well, it's always going to be true. So this loop is going to continue indefinitely. I don't know how long this loop is going to continue, which can be a useful thing. For example, when I'm entering my thrust here, so thrust is an integer input. If my thrust is greater than 100, I will print exceeding my safety threshold, and the engine will shut down, set the thrust to 0, and I'll use what's called a break statement. Break statements prematurely exit out of the while loop, even if the condition is true. So in this case, that's a good thing, because if my thrust is greater than 100, and that's my safety threshold, I want my engine to shut down, and I want to stop asking for thrust because I might damage my engine. So this break statement is actually what is controlling how long my loop is going to run. So it could be an infinite loop if I kept entering thrust below 100, but if I ever did, it actually would be end the loop, and it'd be a finite loop. If I keep my thrust below 100, I'm going to say print the thrust is at that string thrust there, and I'm going to wait 10 seconds before I ask for the thrust again. So if we run that, actually let's change this to 5 because I'm kind of impatient. Now I'm going to say enter thrust. Let's say I'm going to shoot it up to 75. and says thrust is at 75. Perfect. That means that it's working. So then I wait 5 seconds, and let's say I want to push it a little bit. Let's go 102. See if I can push the limits. And nope, my engine shut down. This break statement breaks me out of the loop, and I'm not going to be able to enter my thrust anymore. I kind of ruined my engine. So now I have safely protected my engine, but you know, I'm out of the loop. So, well, out of the loop. So again, with infinite loops, it's going to use it's while true, and this is the proper way of making an infinite loop or an indefinite loop, is while true. You don't want to say while thrust is, you know, less than 1,000, or, you know, you have something where x is less than 10, and then x equals 1, and you're never changing 1, right? In this case, this is still the same effective thing, but it's kind of confusing, right? X is 1. Is x less than 10? Well, it is, so this is true, but why not literally just replace this with while true, which is going to repeat indefinitely, right? So this is going to create an infinite loop, which is only going to end if this condition is true, which is where infinite loops are useful. If you're checking a condition on the inside of a loop and you don't know when it's going to be true, you would use an infinite loop in that case. So that's the usefulness of an infinite loop. We'll talk a little bit more about different when while loops are useful and for loops and for in loops are useful, because there are specific applications for each. But this is kind of a little brief overview of a while loop. And infinite loops, they can be problematic if you don't expect them, but if you are planning for them, they're kind of useful. So that's while loops in a nutshell. But let's go ahead and summarize everything. So first off, loops allow programmers to repeat a code block. Also, each time the code block repeats, that is known as an iteration. So sometimes you can have infinite iterations or a specific number of iterations, if you know that. The number of iterations can be controlled by an increment variable, which in our case, with the first example, was x. And x started as 1, and we changed x up until it was 10, and that was our increment. Each one was an iteration. The code block in a while loop only runs if the condition is true. That's a key point. So if whatever you put on the inside of the while loop will only run if that condition right after the while statement is true. So it's not going to run if it's false. It's still the same thing as an if-else statement in that regards. Also, break statements allow the loop to end even if the condition is still true. So that's how we break out of infinite loops, and that's also a really useful thing if you're checking secondary conditions inside of your while loop. And then lastly, infinite loops occur when the condition in the while loop is always true. Like where we said while true, that's always true, and infinite loops can be useful. So just keep track of those, and happy programming.